Careful, everyone's watching. The words came with a quiet laugh, but the intent was sharp, deliberate, placed like a spotlight in the middle of the room. Crystal glasses caught the golden light overhead, reflections dancing across polished marble and tailored suits. At table 12, Ethan Caldwell didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. One sentence from him carried farther than most people shouting. Conversation slowed. Forks hovered midair. Even the soft piano in the corner seemed to hesitate. Clara Bennett stood beside the table, a simple black uniform against a sea of tailored luxury. Her tray rested steady in her left hand. Not a single glass trembled. Not a drop moved. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers brushing the edge of his watch, the kind that didn't just tell time. It reminded people who owned it. His eyes moved over her, not unkind, but measuring, calculating. Go on, he said, just loud enough. Explain the pairing. Or was that recommendation just guesswork? A ripple of quiet amusement passed through the table. Not loud, not cruel, just enough. Enough to make a point. Enough to place her exactly where he thought she belonged. Clara didn't answer right away. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Long enough for the room to settle into expectation. Long enough for everyone to decide what they were about to witness. Her posture didn't change. Her breathing didn't shift. Only her eyes lifted, steady, level, meeting his without resistance, without apology. Then she spoke. Soft, clear. The Cabernet works because of the fat content in the ribeye, she said, her voice cutting through the space without rising. But this one, a slight pause, a glance at the bottle, leans heavier on tannins than your chef anticipated tonight. A few heads tilted. Subtle. Curious. She continued, still calm, still even. You'd get a cleaner balance with something lighter. Maybe a 2018 Pinot. Less aggressive. Lets the dish speak instead of competing with it. The words didn't rush. They landed. One by one. Precise. The faint smile on Ethan's face didn't disappear. But it changed. Just slightly. Enough that someone paying attention would notice. Someone always was. He tapped his finger once against the table. Interesting, he said. So you're saying I made the wrong choice? It wasn't a question. It was a second move. A push. The room leaned in again. Waiting. Clara adjusted the tray in her hand. Smooth. Effortless. I'm saying, she replied, that you chose a wine that assumes control. A small pause. Not every dish needs that. This time, the silence was different. Not awkward. Not tense. Just still. Something shifted. You could feel it. Like the air had changed direction without anyone announcing it. Ethan's gaze held hers a second longer than before. Measuring again. Recalculating. Around them, no one laughed now. No one reached for their glass. Even the investors at the far end of the table had stopped pretending not to listen. Clara gave a small nod, professional, composed. Would you like me to bring the alternative? She asked. No edge. No challenge. Just the question. Simple. Clean. But it didn't feel simple anymore. Ethan didn't answer immediately. For the first time that evening, he paused. And somewhere at the table, barely above a whisper, someone said her name. Not as a question. As recognition. The name did not echo loudly, but it carried. Just enough for Ethan to hear it clearly. Just enough to settle into the space between them. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition trying to form. Clara Bennett. He had heard it before. Not here. Not in a place like this. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere that required more than surface-level attention. He leaned back slightly, shifting his posture, no longer performing for the table, now studying her with a different kind of focus. Around them, the room held its breath without realizing it. One of the investors adjusted his cufflinks, but his eyes never left Clara. Another reached for his glass, then stopped halfway, as if the moment deserved more stillness than movement. Ethan tapped his finger once more against the table, slower this time. You seem very certain, he said, his tone no longer laced with amusement, but with curiosity sharpened by something else. That kind of certainty usually comes from experience, not from reading a menu. Clara did not respond immediately. She shifted the tray from her left hand to her right, a small, controlled motion that made the glassware catch the light again. Her posture remained unchanged. Calm. Grounded. Experience does not always announce itself, she said quietly. Sometimes it just shows up when it is needed. A faint murmur moved through the table. Not disagreement. Not agreement. Just awareness. Ethan's gaze held hers. longer now, searching for something behind the composure. And where exactly did yours come from, he asked. This time, the question was not a trap. It was a test of a different kind. Not to expose her, to understand her. Clara's eyes flickered for the briefest moment. Not hesitation, not fear, just a calculation of how much truth belonged in a room like this. From places that required precision, she answered. Where being wrong was not an option. The words were simple, but they landed heavier than before. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing the rim of his glass, but he did not lift it. Something in the rhythm of the evening had changed, and he was aware of it now. Fully aware. Then answer me this, he said, leaning forward slightly, lowering his voice so that only the table could hear, though everyone in the room was already listening. If you had control of the entire pairing tonight, what would you change? It was not a challenge thrown across the room anymore. It was an invitation placed carefully between them. Clara glanced at the table, the arrangement, the sequence, the choices already made. Then back at him. I would not change everything, she said. Only the parts that are trying too hard to impress. A pause. Just enough. Balance does not come from control. It comes from knowing when to step back. Silence followed. Not empty. Full. Ethan's expression shifted again, subtle but undeniable. The confidence was still there. The authority had not disappeared. But something underneath it had been adjusted, like a lens refocusing. At the far end of the table, one of the senior partners cleared his throat softly. I think, he said, choosing his words carefully, we may have overlooked something important tonight. It was not directed at Clara. It was not directed at Ethan. But it changed the weight of the room all the same. Ethan sat back slowly, his hand resting on the table, no longer tapping, no longer performing, just thinking. Then, almost to himself, but audible enough, he said, Clara Bennett. The name felt different now. Not a detail, not background, something else entirely. And for the first time that evening, he was not the one controlling the direction of the conversation. He was following it. The room did not return to normal. It could not. Something invisible had shifted, and everyone felt it, even if no one could explain it. Clara remained where she was, still holding the tray, still composed, but no longer just part of the background. She had become the center without asking for it. Ethan glanced down at the wine in his glass, turning it slightly, watching how the light moved through it. For a moment, he said nothing. That alone was enough to make people notice. He was not a man who paused without purpose. You said balance comes from knowing when to step back, he finally said, his voice quieter now, stripped of performance. Most people in this room built everything by stepping forward, by taking control. His eyes lifted again, steady on hers. So tell me, when did you learn to do the opposite? It was not a challenge anymore. It was something closer to respect, though he had not admitted that yet. Clara shifted her weight slightly, the only sign that time was still moving. The rest of her remained unchanged. When stepping forward cost more than it gave, she answered. No elaboration. No story attached. Just the truth, delivered in the same calm tone. Ethan studied her face, searching for the missing pieces she refused to hand over. Across the table, one of the younger investors leaned toward another, whispering something under his breath, but even that felt out of place now, like noise in a room that had chosen silence. Ethan set his glass down gently, the soft click against the table sounding louder than it should have. You speak like someone who has been in rooms like this before, he said. Not just serving them. Clara did not deny it. She did not confirm it either. Instead, she reached for the empty glass nearest to her, adjusting it slightly, aligning it with the others. A small action. Precise. Intentional. Rooms are not defined by who sits in them, she said. They're defined by what people choose to notice. Another pause. Shorter this time. Most people notice status. Very few notice substance. The words settled slowly, like something that needed time to be understood. Ethan leaned back again, but this time it was different. Not control. Not dominance. Consideration. He glanced briefly at the others at the table, then back at Clara, as if recalibrating the entire dynamic in real time. And which one do you think I noticed? He asked. Clara met his gaze without hesitation. At first, she said, status. A quiet ripple moved through the table. Not laughter, not discomfort, recognition. She continued, her tone unchanged. Now, I am not so sure. That landed deeper than anything before it. Not because it was sharp, but because it was honest. Ethan exhaled, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth, not defensive, not dismissive, but something closer to acceptance. Fair, he said. For a brief second, the tension dissolved into something almost human. Then, from the far end of the table, a voice spoke up, older, measured. Caldwell, the man said, adjusting his glasses, we should revisit the projections before we finalize anything tonight. It was subtle, but it was a shift. The conversation was no longer orbiting Ethan alone. He noticed it. Of course he did. His eyes flickered, just slightly, toward the speaker, then back to Clara. And in that moment, something connected. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. You have read our projections, he said, more statement than question. Clara did not move. I have seen them, she replied. The difference between the two words did not go unnoticed. Ethan's expression sharpened again, but not in the same way as before. This was not control. This was realization forming. That is not possible, someone at the table muttered quietly. Clara did not respond to that. She only adjusted her grip on the tray, preparing to step away, as if her role in this moment was complete. But Ethan spoke again, stopping her without raising his voice. Wait. The single word carried differently now. Not as an order, as a request. And for the first time that evening, the entire room was not waiting to see if she would fail. They were waiting to see what she would choose to do next. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have. Wait. Clara did not turn immediately. Not out of defiance, but out of control. She finished placing the final glass on her tray, aligning it with the others, her movements steady, unhurried. Only then did she look back. Ethan had not moved. But something in his posture had. The edge was gone. What remained was focus. Real focus. You have seen them, he repeated, quieter now, as if testing the weight of her words. Around the table, the others exchanged brief glances, subtle, uncertain. This was no longer a performance they recognized. This was something else. Clara held his gaze for a moment, then lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission, but in thought. Documents travel, she said. More than people realize. A faint shift moved through the room. Not disbelief. Not yet. Just the beginning of it. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, his hands clasped loosely. Our projections are not public, he said. No accusation. Just fact. Clara nodded once. No, she agreed. They are not. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it. It was no longer about wine. No longer about service. It was about something that did not belong in a room like this. Ethan's eyes sharpened, not aggressively, but with intent. Then tell me something that is not in the presentation, he said. Something only someone who has actually read them would know. The request was precise. Measured. This was how he operated. Clara did not hesitate this time. Your third quarter forecast assumes stability in a market that has already begun to shift, she said calmly. You accounted for external volatility, but not internal overextension. A pause. Small. Deliberate. You expanded too quickly in regions that have not fully stabilized. The margins look strong now, but they are not sustainable past 12 months. No one moved. Not a glass. Not a breath. The words did not sound dramatic. They sounded correct. Ethan's expression did not change immediately, but his fingers tightened slightly against each other. That was enough. At the far end of the table, the older man who had spoken earlier leaned back, his eyes narrowing in thought. That is, he began, then stopped, as if choosing not to finish the sentence too quickly. Ethan did not look away from Clara. And what would you suggest? He asked. The question came without hesitation, without pride. That alone shifted the room again. Clara adjusted the tray slightly against her hip. Slow down, she said. Not everywhere. Just where growth is masking instability. She met his eyes again. Control is not always about moving faster. Sometimes it is about knowing where not to move at all. The words settled deeper than before. Not because they were louder, but because they were harder to ignore. Ethan leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, his gaze drifting for a brief moment to the center of the table, where the untouched wine sat between them, then back to her. You speak like someone who has been in the room when these decisions were made, he said. Clara did not answer directly. I speak like someone who has seen what happens when they are not questioned, she replied. Another silence. This one different. Not tense. Not heavy. Just honest. Ethan's jaw shifted slightly, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement. Around him, the table had changed. No one interrupted. No one redirected. The authority had not disappeared. It had redistributed. Finally, Ethan reached for his glass again, but he did not drink. He simply held it, thoughtful. "Bring the Pinot," he said quietly. It was a decision, a small one, but in that moment, it carried more weight than the contract they had come to discuss. Clara gave a slight nod. Professional, composed. Then she turned. Not rushed, not lingering, just moving forward. But as she took her first step away, Ethan spoke again, softer than before. "Clara." She paused, not turning fully this time, just enough to listen. "We are not done with this conversation." It was not a command. It was not a promise. It was something in between. And for the first time that evening, Clara allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch her expression. Not victory, not satisfaction, just recognition. Then she walked away, leaving behind a table that no longer felt the same. The door to the kitchen closed softly behind Clara, but the shift she left behind did not stay contained. It followed her. It lingered at table 12, settling into every untouched glass, every unfinished sentence. Ethan did not speak for several seconds after she left. Not because he had nothing to say, because he was deciding what mattered now. The older partner across from him leaned forward slightly, fingers interlaced. "She is not wrong," he said quietly. No one challenged him. That alone said enough. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the space Clara had just occupied, as if the air itself still held her presence. "No," he replied after a moment. "She is not." The admission was calm, controlled, but it carried weight. Around the table, posture shifted. Subtle, but undeniable. The dynamic had changed, and everyone knew it. One of the younger investors cleared his throat. "We can revisit the projections tomorrow," he offered, cautious. "With the full team." Ethan shook his head. Slightly. "Tomorrow is too late," he said. Not sharp, not dismissive, just certain. He reached for the tablet resting beside his plate, tapping the screen once, bringing up the financial model they had spent weeks refining. Numbers filled the display. Clean, impressive, and now questionable. His finger hovered over the third quarter column, then stopped. "We built this assuming momentum would carry itself," he said, more to the table than to anyone in particular. "It does not." Silence answered him. Agreement without needing to be spoken. At the far end, the older partner nodded once. "Correction now is easier than explanation later," he said. Ethan allowed the smallest hint of a smile. Not satisfaction, recognition. He set the tablet down, then finally reached for his glass, lifting it slightly, but again, he did not drink. Instead, he looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "We adjust tonight," he said. It was not a suggestion, but it was no longer a command either. It was a decision shared, and that made all the difference. In the kitchen, Clara moved through the narrow space with the same quiet efficiency as before, but her focus had shifted. Not outward, inward. She reached for the bottle of Pinot, her fingers steady against the glass, reading the label without really seeing it. The noise of the kitchen surrounded her. Plates, voices, movement. None of it touched her. "You are going to get in trouble," a voice said behind her, half teasing, half concerned. It was Mia, another server, watching her with raised eyebrows. Clara did not turn immediately. She picked up the bottle, balanced it against her palm, then glanced over her shoulder. "For what?" she asked simply. Mia let out a quiet laugh. "For talking like that to a man who probably owns half the city." Clara's expression did not change. "He does not own me," she said. No defiance, just fact. Mia studied her for a second, then shook her head with a small smile. "No," she said. "I do not think he does." Clara turned back, grabbing a clean cloth, wiping the neck of the bottle with slow precision. "Table 12 requested a different wine," she added, her tone returning to neutral, professional. "Then I guess you impressed him," Mia said lightly. Clara paused for a fraction of a second, just enough to acknowledge the thought. "Or, she replied." He decided to listen. She picked up the glasses, placing them onto her tray, aligning them carefully. The same way she always did. Nothing about her movements suggested anything had changed. And yet everything had. Back at the table, Ethan set his glass down and stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the evening was no longer following the plan it started with. "I will handle the revisions," he said. "Tonight." No one questioned him, but no one simply agreed either. They watched him differently now, as if they were seeing not just the man who led, but the man who could adjust. And as Clara stepped back into the dining room, carrying the new bottle with quiet certainty, she did not look at him first. She did not need to. The room had already shifted, and this time, it was not going back. Clara stepped back into the dining room as if nothing had changed, the tray balanced evenly in her hand, the bottle of Pinot catching the warm light above her. But everything had changed. The air felt different, quieter, but not empty, focused. Conversations at nearby tables had softened, as if people instinctively understood that something worth paying attention to was still unfolding. At table 12, Ethan remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze fixed not on his tablet, not on his investors, but on the space where Clara would return. Then he sat down again, slower this time, as if the act itself required more thought than before. When Clara approached, no one spoke. She placed the glasses down one by one, each movement deliberate, precise, the soft clink of glass against table sounding clearer than any voice in the room. Ethan watched her, not with curiosity now, but with recognition that had not fully formed into words. The 2018, she said quietly, presenting the bottle, her tone neutral, professional. From Willamette Valley. He nodded once. Poor, he said, but the word lacked the weight it had carried earlier. It was no longer an instruction. It was acceptance. Clara poured with steady hands, the deep red liquid settling into each glass, catching the light in a way that made it look almost still. When she finished, she stepped back slightly, allowing space, but not disappearing. Ethan lifted the glass, swirling it gently, watching how it moved. He took a small sip. This time, he did not analyze it out loud. He simply let the moment settle. Then he nodded again, more to himself than to anyone else. Better, he said. Across the table, the older partner exhaled softly, almost like a quiet confirmation. Much better, he added. The agreement was immediate, but not exaggerated. It did not need to be. Ethan set the glass down, then looked up at Clara, meeting her eyes directly. You knew that before I asked, he said. It was not a question. Clara held his gaze for a brief moment. Yes, she replied. No explanation followed. None was needed. Ethan leaned back slightly, his fingers resting loosely against the table. Most people would have corrected me immediately, he said. Or tried to. Clara tilted her head just slightly, considering the statement. Most people want to be right, she said. That does not always make them useful. A faint shift of expression crossed Ethan's face. Not offense. Something closer to understanding. Around the table, no one reacted outwardly, but the attention remained fixed. No one had returned to their phones. No one had resumed side conversations. Clara was no longer invisible. Ethan glanced down at the tablet again, then back at her. You said we expanded too quickly, he continued. Where would you pull back first? The question landed differently now. Not as a test. As an invitation to continue. Clara did not rush her answer. She looked at the table again, then at the screen, though she had not been shown it directly. Eastern Division, she said. Your infrastructure there is still stabilizing. Growth is outpacing support. A pause. It looks strong because it is new, not because it is solid. One of the investors shifted in his seat, a subtle reaction that did not go unnoticed. Ethan's eyes flickered briefly in that direction, then returned to Clara. And if we do not adjust, he asked. Clara's expression did not change. You will not notice the problem immediately, she said. That is what makes it dangerous. The words settled deeper than anything before. Not dramatic, not forceful, just clear. Ethan exhaled slowly, nodding once, as if confirming something he had already begun to suspect. He reached for his glass again, taking another sip, this time with less analysis and more acceptance. Stay, he said quietly. The word was simple, but it carried weight. Not as an order, not as a request. Something in between. Clara did not respond right away. She glanced at the other tables in her section, then back at him. I have other responsibilities, she said calmly. Ethan held her gaze. So do I, he replied. A brief silence passed between them. Not tense, not uncertain, just balanced. And for the first time that evening, neither of them was trying to control it. Clara did not move right away. The tray remained balanced in her hand, her posture unchanged, but something in her stillness carried more weight now. Around them, the restaurant continued in quiet motion, But table 12 existed in its own rhythm, separate from everything else. Ethan watched her, not impatient, not demanding. Waiting. That alone made the moment different. Clara glanced once more at the other tables in her section, measuring time, responsibility, expectation. Then back at him. 5 minutes, she said finally. Not asking, not negotiating, just defining the boundary. Ethan nodded once. 5 is enough, he replied. She set the tray down carefully at the edge of the table, placing it where it would not interfere, where it would not suggest permanence. Then she pulled the empty chair slightly closer, but she did not sit fully. Not yet. Just resting her hand lightly on the back of it, as if reminding herself that she could leave at any moment. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. You do not have to stand, he said. Clara met his eyes. I know, she answered. Then, after a brief pause, she sat. The shift was subtle, but it changed everything again. Not because she lowered herself, because she chose to stay. Across the table, no one spoke. No one interrupted. The presence of a waitress at the table should have felt out of place. It did not. Ethan turned the tablet toward her slightly, not fully offering it, but no longer keeping it guarded. Show me, he said. The words were simple, but the implication was not. Clara looked at the screen, her eyes moving across the numbers with quiet familiarity. Not scanning. Understanding. She did not reach for the device. She did not need to. Your revenue curve here, she said, nodding toward the third quarter projection. It assumes continued efficiency at scale. Ethan followed her line of sight. It is based on current performance, he said. Clara shook her head slightly. It is based on current appearance, she corrected. The distinction was small, but it landed. Ethan's fingers tapped once against the table, not out of impatience, but habit. Explain, he said. Clara leaned forward just slightly, enough to bring her closer to the screen, but not enough to invade the space. You are measuring output, she said. Not strain. A brief pause. Your systems are holding. For now. But they are compensating, not sustaining. One of the investors frowned slightly, leaning in. Compensating how, he asked. Clara did not look at him. She kept her focus on the model. Delayed response times. Increased internal costs that are being absorbed instead of reported. You are not seeing it yet because it is being managed quietly. The room stilled again. Ethan's expression sharpened, not defensively, but with recognition forming faster now. Hidden inefficiencies, he said. Clara nodded once. Exactly. Ethan leaned back, exhaling slowly, his gaze drifting for a moment before returning to her. And when do they stop being hidden? He asked. Clara's answer came without hesitation. When they can no longer be absorbed. A small silence followed. Then she added, softer, usually all at once. That settled deeper than anything before. Ethan's jaw shifted slightly, his mind moving ahead, recalculating, adjusting. Across the table, the older partner nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had not yet put into words. Ethan looked back at Clara, studying her with a new level of clarity. You have seen this happen before, he said. Clara held his gaze. Yes, she replied. No elaboration. No story. Just truth. Ethan's fingers stilled completely now. No tapping. No movement. Just focus. Where, he asked. The question hung there, quieter than any before it. Not a demand. Not a test. Something closer to understanding the origin of what stood in front of him. Clara did not answer immediately. For the first time, her eyes shifted slightly, not away, but inward, as if deciding whether the past belonged in this moment. The room waited. Not because they expected an answer, because they understood that whatever came next would matter. Clara's gaze did not return immediately. For a brief moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to press back in, distant but present, like a reminder that this was still just a room, still just a night, still just a conversation that could end at any time. Then she looked at him again. A place that looked very much like this one, she said. Her voice stayed even. No weight added. No detail offered. Ethan watched her closely, recognizing the boundary in her tone. She was not avoiding the question. She was defining it. And what happened, he asked. Not pushing, not pulling, just opening the space. Clara's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, steady, controlled. They expanded too fast, she said. They trusted the numbers because the numbers were clean. A small pause. But clean numbers can hide messy systems. Across the table, One of the investors shifted slightly, his attention sharpening. Ethan leaned forward just a fraction, his focus narrowing. And when it broke, he asked. Clara did not look away. It did not break all at once, she said. That is the part people misunderstand. Another pause, softer this time. It started quietly. Small delays. Minor inconsistencies. Things that seemed manageable. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the tablet, then back to him. Until they were not. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Not dramatic. Just real. Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition that was becoming harder to ignore. And the people in charge? He asked. Clara's gaze held his. They believed they could fix it later, she said. After the next quarter. After the next milestone. A faint shift of her head. There is always a next thing to wait for. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers pressing lightly against the table, grounding himself in the moment. And you? He asked. What was your role? The question landed differently. Not about strategy. About her. Clara did not answer right away. This time, the pause stretched longer, not uncomfortable, but intentional. When she spoke, her voice was quieter. I pointed it out, she said. Early. No emphasis. No claim. Just fact. Ethan's eyes did not leave hers. And he asked. Clara's expression did not change. They listened, she said. A small pause. Until it became inconvenient. The words settled deeper than anything before. Not because they were sharp. Because they were familiar. Around the table, no one moved. No one interrupted. Even the faint sounds from the rest of the restaurant seemed to fall away again. Ethan leaned back slowly, processing, connecting, recalibrating. So they ignored you, he said. Clara shook her head slightly. Not at first, she replied. That is what makes it easy to miss. A brief silence. Then, softer, they agreed. They just did not act. That landed harder than accusation ever could. Ethan's jaw shifted, his mind already moving ahead, applying the pattern, seeing the parallels unfold in real time. Across from him, the older partner lowered his gaze briefly, as if recognizing something he had chosen not to say earlier. Ethan looked back at Clara, his voice quieter now, stripped of any remaining distance. And when it collapsed, he asked. Clara's eyes held steady. They called it unexpected, she said. No bitterness. No frustration. Just truth. Another silence followed. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just clear. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something he could not ignore anymore. And you left, he said. Clara did not confirm it directly. She simply said, I learned. The difference mattered. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. His gaze softened, not in sympathy, but in respect that had fully replaced whatever had been there before. He glanced down at the tablet again, then back at her, the connection now undeniable. You are seeing the same pattern here, he said. Clara met his eyes. Yes, she replied. Simple. Certain. And for the first time that evening, no one at the table questioned her. No one spoke for several seconds after that. Not because they were unsure, but because the truth had already settled into the room, and there was nothing left to interrupt it. Ethan remained still, his eyes on Clara, but his mind had moved beyond the table, beyond the restaurant, into projections, timelines, consequences. He could already see it. The strain she described. The delay. The quiet accumulation of problems that did not announce themselves until they became impossible to ignore. He had seen it before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. His fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the table, no longer tapping, no longer restless. Just anchored. If we adjust now, he said slowly, we absorb the impact early. It was not a question. Clara gave a small nod. Yes, she said. You trade speed for stability. A brief pause. And you keep control. Ethan exhaled through his nose, the faintest sign of agreement. Across the table, the older partner leaned forward slightly, his voice measured. And if we do not? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Clara's gaze shifted to him, calm, direct. Then the market will make the adjustment for you, she said. And you will not control how it happens. The words landed without force, but they carried more weight than anything said that evening. The investor leaned back again, silent. Ethan glanced down at the tablet once more, his eyes scanning the numbers that had looked so certain just an hour ago. Now they felt incomplete. Not wrong, just not enough. He looked back at Clara. You said you pointed it out early, he said. At your last company. Clara nodded once. I did. Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly. And they waited. Yes. A brief pause. They waited until the decision became more expensive than the problem. Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. That sounds familiar, he said. Clara did not respond. She did not need to. Around them, the table had fully shifted now. No one was watching Clara as a curiosity anymore. They were listening to her as a reference point. A standard. Ethan straightened slightly in his chair, his posture returning, but not to what it had been before. This was different. Less about control, more about clarity. He turned the tablet fully toward the table this time, no longer guarding it, no longer filtering it. We revised the Eastern Division projections, he said. Reduce the growth assumption by 15%. Increase operational buffers. One of the investors nodded immediately. Another leaned in, already recalculating. The conversation resumed, but it was not the same conversation. It had direction now, and that direction had not come from him alone. Clara remained seated for a moment longer, watching the shift unfold without inserting herself into it. She did not need to guide it. It was already moving. Ethan noticed. He always noticed. He looked at her again, his voice quieter now, separate from the table. You could have said nothing, he said. Clara met his eyes. Yes, she replied. But then nothing would change. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded once. Not acknowledgement of her words. Acknowledgement of her choice. Across the table, the older partner closed his notebook slowly, his expression thoughtful. We have spent weeks preparing for tonight, he said. And 5 minutes changed the direction of the entire discussion. He glanced briefly at Clara, then back at Ethan. That is not something we should ignore. Ethan followed his gaze, then returned it to Clara. The meaning was clear, even if no one said it directly. Clara stood then, her hand returning to the back of the chair, steady, composed. My 5 minutes are up, she said simply. No hesitation. No expectation. Just a boundary held. Ethan did not stop her this time, but his voice followed her as she stepped back. Clara. She paused, just slightly. This conversation is not finished, he said. Not as a question, not as a command, as something that had already been decided. Clara allowed the smallest pause, then gave a quiet nod. Not agreement, not refusal, just acknowledgement. Then she picked up her tray and walked away, leaving behind a table that no longer belonged to the man who had tried to control it, but to the truth that had quietly taken its place. The rhythm of the table resumed, but it no longer belonged to habit. It moved with intention now, shaped by something that had not been part of the plan an hour ago. Clara walked away without looking back, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, as if nothing unusual had happened. But behind her, the weight of her presence remained. Ethan watched her go for a second longer than necessary, then turned back to the table, his focus returning with sharper clarity. 15% reduction in Eastern, he repeated, more firmly now. Reallocate resources to stabilize infrastructure before expansion. The younger investor nodded quickly, already adjusting numbers on his own device. Another leaned forward, his tone more engaged than before. We should also review internal cost absorption, he added. If what she said is accurate, we are under reporting strain. Ethan did not respond immediately. He tapped the screen once, bringing up a deeper layer of data, something not included in the presentation. His eyes moved quickly, scanning, connecting. Then he nodded once. We are, he said. No hesitation. No defensiveness. Just confirmation. The admission shifted the table again. Not intention. In alignment. The older partner closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with a faint exhale. Then we correct it now, he said. Ethan glanced at him, then at the others, reading the room not as authority, but as agreement. We correct it now, he echoed. The decision settled into place, not forced, not debated. Accepted. Around them, the restaurant slowly returned to its natural rhythm, but table 12 remained distinct, like a current moving beneath the surface. Clara moved between other tables with the same quiet efficiency, refilling glasses, clearing plates, responding to requests without drawing attention. But attention followed her anyway. Not openly, not dramatically, just enough that people noticed. She did not react to it. She did not acknowledge it. She simply continued. In the kitchen, Mia leaned against the counter, watching her return with an unreadable expression. So, what exactly did you say out there? She asked, half curious, half impressed. Clara set down the empty tray, placing it carefully in its usual spot. Nothing new, she replied. Mia raised an eyebrow. It did not look like nothing, she said. Clara reached for a clean cloth, folding it once, then again. Sometimes people just hear things at the right time, she said. Mia studied her for a moment, then shook her head with a quiet laugh. You are impossible, she said. Clara allowed the faintest hint of a smile, then turned back toward the dining room. At table 12, Ethan stood again, this time with purpose. Not to command attention, to move forward. We finalized the revised structure tonight, he said. No delays. The others nodded, not out of obligation, but agreement. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, slipping it on with the same precision that had defined him earlier, but something about the movement felt lighter now, less rigid. As the meeting began to close, the older partner gathered his notes, pausing for a moment before speaking again. You know, he said, glancing briefly toward the floor where Clara moved between tables. We spend a lot of time looking for expertise in very specific places. Ethan followed his gaze, watching her for a second, then longer than that. Yes, he said quietly. The partner nodded. And sometimes, we miss it entirely. Ethan did not respond immediately. His eyes remained on Clara, but his expression had changed again. Not curiosity, not surprise, something more settled. Not tonight, he said finally. The words were quiet, but they carried certainty. He reached for the check, glancing at the total without really seeing it, then added a number that had nothing to do with the meal itself. Not excessive, not performative, just deliberate. As Clara approached to collect it, she did not look at the amount first. She looked at him. Thank you, she said, her tone neutral, professional. Ethan held her gaze for a brief moment. That is not what this is for, he replied. Clara tilted her head slightly. Then what is it for? She asked. Ethan paused, choosing his words with more care than he had at the beginning of the evening. For knowing when to say something, he said. A small silence followed. Clara nodded once, accepting the answer without expanding it. Then she took the check and turned away again. Ethan watched her leave, but this time, there was no question in his expression. Only a quiet certainty that this was not the end of what had started tonight. The check disappeared into Clara's hand as seamlessly as everything else she did, but the moment did not disappear with it. It lingered, not in the open, not in conversation, but in the quiet awareness that followed Ethan as he stepped away from the table. The meeting had ended, but the shift it created had not. Outside, the night air was cooler, sharper, carrying the distant hum of the city without interruption. Ethan paused just beyond the restaurant doors, adjusting his jacket out of habit, though nothing about him needed adjusting. His mind was still inside, still at the table, still on her. Behind him, the investors filtered out one by one, their conversations quieter than before, more focused, less certain in the way they had been earlier. The older partner stepped beside him, hands in his coat pockets, his expression thoughtful. You are going to follow up on that, he said, not as a question. Ethan did not look at him immediately. His gaze remained forward, unfixed, processing. Yes, he replied. Simple. Definite. The partner nodded once. Good, he said. Because that was not luck. Ethan allowed the faintest exhale, almost a quiet agreement. No, he said. It was not. A brief silence passed between them, not uncomfortable, just complete. Then the partner gave a small nod and moved on, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. Inside, Clara moved through the final stretch of her shift with the same steady rhythm, clearing the last tables, stacking plates, resetting spaces that would be filled again tomorrow. Nothing in her pace suggested anything unusual had happened. No one watching her closely would have seen it. But a few people were watching. Not openly, not intentionally, just enough to notice the difference they could not name. Mia leaned against the counter again as Clara passed by, her eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity. He is still outside, she said quietly. Clara did not stop. That is his choice, she replied. Mia tilted her head. And if he comes back in? Clara reached for a glass, polishing it slowly, her movements precise. Then I will still be working, she said. No anticipation, no avoidance, just fact. Mia studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly, as if understanding something she had not expected to. Outside, Ethan finally reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He did not scroll. He did not check messages. He simply held it there for a moment, then opened a single contact. His assistant. "I need a full internal review of Eastern Division," he said when the line connected. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was something new beneath it. Urgency without panic. "Tonight," he added. A pause. "No summaries. I want the details we are not seeing." He ended the call without waiting for confirmation. It was already understood. He lowered the phone, glancing back toward the restaurant windows, where the warm light still spilled onto the sidewalk. For a brief moment, he considered leaving, driving away, letting the night end where it should have. But something held him there. Not curiosity, not ego, something quieter. He turned, walking back toward the entrance, his steps unhurried, deliberate. Inside, Clara set the last glass in place, aligning it with the others, her reflection briefly catching in its surface before disappearing again. The door opened behind her. She did not turn immediately. She did not need to. The shift in the room was enough. Ethan stepped back inside, the noise of the city fading behind him as the door closed. This time, he did not scan the room. He did not look for control. He looked for her. And when their eyes met again, there was no audience left to impress. Only a conversation that had not finished. Clara did not look away this time. She stood where she was, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the counter, the other holding a folded cloth that had long since stopped moving. The restaurant had thinned out, the soft hum of conversation replaced by the quieter sounds of closing routines. Chairs shifting, distant clinks of glass. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Ethan walked toward her without hesitation, his pace measured, his presence no longer carrying the same weight it had earlier. Not diminished, just different. When he reached her, he stopped at a respectful distance, not close enough to assume familiarity, not far enough to create distance. "I was not finished," he said, his voice low, steady. Clara tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, unreadable. "Neither was I," she replied. A brief silence followed, but it was not empty. It was balanced. Ethan glanced around for a moment, as if confirming what he already knew. The audience was gone. The performance had ended. What remained was real. He looked back at her. "You left before I could ask the only question that matters," he said. Clara did not rush to respond. She simply waited. "Why are you here?" he continued. "Not in this room. In this job." The question landed softly, but it carried more weight than anything he had asked before. Clara's fingers tightened slightly around the cloth, then relaxed again. She did not look away. "Because I chose to be," she said. Ethan studied her, recognizing the answer for what it was. "True, but incomplete. That is not the whole answer," he said quietly. Clara allowed the faintest shift in her expression, not defensive, not evasive, just aware. "It is enough of one," she replied. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in acceptance of the boundary she was holding. "You could be in any room you wanted," he said. "You know that." Clara's gaze remained steady. "Not every room is worth being in," she said. The words settled between them, quiet but undeniable. Ethan nodded once, absorbing it. "And this one is?" he asked. Clara glanced briefly around the restaurant, then back at him. "Tonight?" she said. It was a small pause. For a moment, Ethan's expression shifted, something thoughtful moving beneath the surface. "And now?" he asked. Clara did not hesitate this time. "Now it is just a restaurant again," she said. "No disappointment. No attachment. Just clarity." Ethan let out a quiet breath, the faintest hint of a smile touching his expression. "That is fair," he said. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a simple business card, turning it once between his fingers before holding it out toward her. He did not step closer. He did not push it into her space. He simply offered it. "I am not going to ask you to leave this job," he said. "And I am not going to pretend I know your reasons." A brief pause. "But I would like to continue this conversation somewhere it does not have a time limit." Clara looked at the card, then at him, her expression unchanged. "Conversations do not need different rooms," she said. "They need different intentions." Ethan held her gaze, recognizing the meaning behind the words. "Then consider this an intention," he replied. The silence that followed was softer than any before. Not uncertain, not tense, just open. Clara reached out then, her fingers brushing lightly against the card as she took it, not quickly, not reluctantly, simply acknowledging it. She did not look at the number. She did not turn it over. She held it for a moment, then slipped it into the pocket of her apron with the same quiet precision she had used all night. "I will think about it," she said. Ethan nodded once, not expecting more, not asking for more. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then Clara stepped back slightly, the distance returning, not as a barrier, but as a boundary restored. "I still have work to finish," she added calmly. Ethan glanced at the room, then back at her, a faint understanding settling in his expression. "Of course you do," he said. And this time, when he turned to leave, he did not look back immediately. Because he already knew. This was not something that needed to be chased. It was something that would either return, or it would not. The door closed softly behind Ethan, and with it, the last trace of the night seemed to settle into stillness. Inside, the restaurant returned fully to itself. Chairs were aligned. Tables reset. Lights dimmed just enough to signal the end of one day and the quiet promise of another. Clara moved through the final motions of her shift with the same steady rhythm, wiping down surfaces, stacking glassware, restoring order to a space that had briefly held something more than routine. Nothing in her expression suggested anything had changed, but something had. Mia watched her from across the room, arms folded loosely, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "You always do that?" she asked after a moment. Clara glanced up briefly. "Do what?" Mia tilted her head. "Shift an entire room without raising your voice." Clara considered the question, then returned her attention to the table in front of her, smoothing the cloth with precise movements. "The room shifts itself," she said quietly. "People just notice at different times." Mia shook her head with a soft laugh. "You are something else," she said, not expecting a reply. Clara did not give one. When the last light was lowered and the final check completed, Clara stepped outside into the cool night air, the city quieter now, its energy softened but still present beneath the surface. She paused for a moment on the sidewalk, reaching into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing against the card Ethan had given her. She pulled it out, turning it once between her fingers, reading the name without surprise. Ethan Caldwell. The title beneath it did not matter. It never had. She looked at it for a moment longer, then slipped it back into her pocket without dialing, without deciding. Not yet. Across the street, a car idled quietly, its engine low, almost unnoticed. Inside, Ethan sat in the back seat, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, though his thoughts were anything but still. The driver waited, saying nothing, accustomed to silence when it mattered. Ethan's phone rested in his hand, the screen dark, untouched. For a moment, he considered calling. Not to instruct, not to negotiate, just to continue. But he did not. Instead, he looked up, his eyes finding the restaurant once more, just in time to see Clara step out into the night. He watched as she paused, as she stood there for a second longer than necessary, then began to walk, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged. There was no hesitation in her movement, no urgency, just direction. Ethan did not open the door. He did not call her name. He did not interrupt the distance she had chosen to keep, because for the first time in a long time, he understood something he had not been able to measure before. Not everything needed to be controlled. Not everything needed to be decided immediately. Some things needed to be respected. He leaned back slightly in his seat, exhaling slowly, the tension of the evening no longer present, replaced by something quieter. Something clearer. "Home, sir?" the driver asked gently. Ethan glanced once more at the figure moving further down the sidewalk, then nodded. "Yes," he said. The car pulled away smoothly, merging into the quiet flow of the city. Clara did not look back. She did not need to. The night carried forward, steady, unchanged on the surface. But somewhere beneath it, something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. And sometimes that was all it took.